What was it like working for legendary railroads like the Erie Lackawanna and the Delaware and Hudson? Today on the Roundhouse, we're going to talk to a guy who worked for both. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to The Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 91 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. Today, we are talking to Steve Vaughan Sr., a career railroader with over 40 years in the industry. Started working for the Erie Lackawanna, then worked for several years on the Delaware and Hudson. He's fired for steam locomotives, including Canadian Pacific 2317 and Milwaukee Road 261. He shares with us stories from his very interesting career. Before we get to that, though, thank you for tuning in. And if you're new to the show, welcome. We've got 90 other great episodes you can listen to on the roundhousepodcast.com. Our guest today was an engineer for the Delaware and Hudson Railroad and recently retired in 2015. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Steve Vaughan Sr. How you doing today, Steve?
Pretty good.
Glad to have you on the show. How did you begin your career in railroading? Did you have an interest in trains already?
Yes, I had an interest at a very young age. HO trains were the thing. My older brother had a Lionel set, but I wound up with HO, and my grandfather worked for the railroad. He worked for the New Haven, and my uncle worked for the Long Island. So, and I didn't live too far from the Bergen County line of the Erie Lackawanna.
So the EL was the first railroad that you hired on with?
Well, yes, as a paid employee. I did the year before, between my my junior and senior year, I started volunteering at the Black River and Western, which was a small tourist line in New Jersey. But they also did the freight work, but I volunteered and wound up as a fireman for them, firing the 60, which was a Great Western 280. And that was the summer of 72. And then the following summer, I wound up going to work for the Erie Lackawanna. I was 9 days out of high school when I started there.
How did your volunteering on the Black River and Western prepare you for what you would have as your full-time career?
Well, it prepared me. I understood how big the equipment was, and I did understood brake tests and couple and air hoses. In fact, a gentleman that worked for the Erie Lackawanna knew that and he said, when I hired out on the Erie, he said, act like you don't know, and forget about what you had there, not meaning that forget it, but don't let on that you've already done this. And it actually helped me because then, the guys don't think, oh, you're a smart aleck, you think you know everything. And so, I never really told anybody till I was well on my way working that, oh, yeah, by the way, I did do this. I remember the first day they had me out in the yard after I had taken my physical, and the guy said, well, I'll show you how to couple of hoses, and he did a couple, and then he said to me, well, here, you couple them, and I did it, and he goes, oh, you catch on pretty well, and it was like, I didn't say, well, I've actually done this before, and the only thing about it was I wound up coupling all the hoses after that, it's like, he kind of took a break, but that's okay. But yeah, it did prepare me, it was a little bit different because it was basically we dealt with the passenger train, running back and forth. Then I was the fireman. I was shoveling coal. It was kind of, I don't know if that would happen today the way it happened. I just happened to be there took my girlfriend down at that time to see the steam engine, and happened to ask a guy that actually eventually became Bill with you, and you probably heard his name. He was the fireman with Lloyd, Arkansas that day, and I just happened to ask him, well, how do you get involved in this? And they said, come back next week with work clothes. We'll put you to work, and that's the rest is history. And actually, I was fortunate. The next week I came back, it was the same engine crew, and they said, you can go with us today. And I wound up, shoveling coal and working on the steam engine. And eventually what happened is and it sounds odd, but that 4th of July, they needed a fireman to work on the 4th. And one of the owners, Nelson Tower, said to me, I talked to everybody. They said, you know pretty much everything, and I'm going to be the engineer that day I can't get anybody that's regular fireman. Would you be interested in firing? And he said, if you have any issues, I'll help you. And I said, sure. And that started basically. Then from that point on, I was put on the roster as a fireman to fire the engine. Usually it was about twice a month I'd work there in 72, and then it continued in 73, and that so. It did prepare me for, being around big equipment.
How did you like being a fireman there?
Oh, I enjoyed it. I really did. I mean, I was a lot younger, and it was good work, and, we had a nice group of guys, and it was a lot of fun. And, it was 7 miles going basically downhill one way and 7 miles going uphill the other way. But, it was good. We usually made like 5 trips, so you got a pretty good full long day. Usually started around 6, maybe 6:30 in the morning, getting the engine ready, and then it was usually, I think, the last train we got in, it was like 5 o'clock out of Flemington. So we'd get in probably 5:20, and by the time you put the bank to fire and everything, it was about almost 6 o'clock. So you'd say roughly a 12-hour day, but it was a lot of fun. Years later, a boss on the railroad happened to be there with his wife and saw me. We worked on the railroad, and he saw me, and he knew I was in. So we got talking. He goes, "Oh, you work here too?" I said, "Well, it's more volunteer." And he said, "Oh, you volunteer at the EL?" I said, "Well, no. If you had one of these, maybe, But it was a little different. Plus, I wasn't married and didn't have kids either. So, because I used to have an engineer, that Bill Doherty, I worked with on the D&H when I first came over to the D&H. He used to tease me about, "Oh, you must laugh when they give you a paycheck." And I said, "Well, no, I have a wife, and we're getting married. You need money." So,
well, and you had some good company there. You mentioned Bill Withune, who later became the Smithsonian Institution's, essentially their railroad expert. I forget his exact title while he was there. So it's nifty that you got to interact with guys like him.
Oh yeah, I did. He would drive down. He was at the time going to school or lived in Ithaca, New York, and he would drive down and spend the weekend, usually 2 days, and he would go back. He might do that, once a month or maybe twice, but usually he would do like the 2 days, right back to back. But it's kind of funny because I laugh now. He must have gone right by where I live, because I know I drive up to the live steam track that I belong to, up through Ithaca. So for him to come down to get on 81 or 17 to go down to New Jersey, he would have had to go right by where I live. And I just thought about, that's kind of funny that I remember when I was training, he said, "Oh yeah, he'd drive down like Friday afternoon and would spend the weekend at Lloyd, Arkansas, who was an engineer on the Black River. He would spend that to stay at his house, and he taught me a lot about how to fire the engine and stuff like that. So it's kind of, you meet people, and a very nice man. Couldn't say enough about him. And then I got to meet other people that taught me, and became a regular fireman for an engineer, Norm Cole, who he worked for the Lehigh Valley as a conductor, but he was also in the Second World War in the railroad battalion, and he taught me a lot about steam engines and stuff. I was when I was at the Black River regular, I was basically his regular fireman. Whenever he worked as an engineer, I worked as his fireman.
You hired on with the Erie Lackawanna, which had been the result of a merger of two large railroads, the Erie and the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western. From your experience, how well did it function as a result of that merger?
Oh, it's pretty good. I mean, I worked the East End. I worked out of Hoboken. It was actually what you would call the home terminal, but I mean, but we had the commuter service and a whole bunch of local freights. And in some ways, they did function as two separate railroads, even though they were one, because you had an Erie side and a DL side. And the Erie side, I basically worked the Erie side. Got hired out, and I worked the Erie extra list. There was a DL extra list, and the DL, they had a passenger extra list and a freight extra list, and so did the Erie side. And they were one railroad, and they did function, and it functioned well. I mean, but it would be funny if somebody would say, where you work. I said, well, I'm working. Oh, you're an Erie man. Well, no, I'm an Erie Lackawanna man. I was 5 years old when that merger happened. So, but it functioned pretty well. And unfortunately, because of the commuter service, that's one of the reasons I got hired. Is the way the Erie Lackawanna would do it is they might in the spring of the year they would start hiring guys because of summer vacations. And, if you got hired early enough, when the winter came or into the fall, you might hang on. And instead of getting cut off the extra list, you might be able to go through and next year be there because, they would hire because there'd be people on vacation and they would need guys would go from the freight side into the passenger service side because the guys in passenger service would be on vacation because usually those were the senior men. So they would go in and take the vacancies, and so they would need people to work the freight. As it was, I didn't get qualified passenger until my second year, about 2.5 years on the railroad, before I even saw passenger service. But just, you had to get qualified in that, and there was no need for me to get qualified. I was working the freight side, and then eventually I got promoted as a conductor on the Erie Lackawanna and had to get passenger qualified for the conductor's job too.
What did passenger qualification require?
Well, you needed to know the stations, the schedules, stuff like that. And then you were also handling a lot of money. You had to remit, you had. In fact, I still have my remit books, but I just haven't thrown them out. And you would put in how much money you might collect in a cash fare. You had a fare book. If somebody got on the train and didn't buy a ticket at the station, you would have to punch the ticket. And if it was an open agency, you would charge them 25 cents more for the ticket. It doesn't sound like a lot of money, but back then it was. 1974, 75, so it wasn't really expensive, but it was some extra money, and you would have to do that if you had to know what stations were open and stuff like that, what ticket agencies, because some might close. And a lot of the guys, I got to know actually remembered me too, because I would always hang around the station at Fairlawn. And that's where I grew up, in Fairlawn, New Jersey. So the train station was 2 blocks from my house. And I actually had, instead of most kids having a paper route, I was the paper boy at the train station in the morning, 5 days a week. So I would get up before school and go there and sell the newspapers. So some of the conductors would got to know me that way, some of the people.
Were any of the trains at that point, the commuter trains, the electric-powered MU cars?
No, that was the DL side. We had the push-pulls on our side, on the Erie side. They were push-pull. They were actually fairly new. I think they came in someplace in the early, 1970. I could be wrong, maybe 69, someplace. But they were the big G Bluebirds, as the engineers used to call them. And they were, the I think it was Bombier, or somebody built the cars. They were, had all electric doors on them and everything.
Were any of the long distance trains still in service by that point?
No. The only ones what you wouldn't call them long distance, but the Port Jervis trains were still running with the E units at that time. and the Stillwells. But there were no run-through trains to either Scranton or Binghamton or on to Chicago at that time. I think they dropped out in early, like the 1970, like January of that year.
What was a memorable experience for you while you were on the EL?
Oh, I had a couple. Like working the local we used to have this one local 1671. That was a nice job to work. It was an all-day job, but you went up the Jersey, New York, and then you went over the Piermont branch to Suffern, and then you returned the main line, and it was enjoyable, because you did work all the way, but there were periods in there where you would be riding.
Were you there for the transition to Conrail?
Yeah, just right in the beginning. I wound up. I left Erie Lackawanna to go to the D&H at the end of April, but I did work like that 1 month, and that's actually how I wound up with the D&H, is when the Delaware and Hudson started to run to Buffalo over the former Erie Lackawanna. They had to acquire EL employees. Well, anybody hired after 1968 on the Erie Lackawanna and train service had rights. There were system rights all the way to Chicago. So when they put out a bid for people to go over, I bid to go over because I had been told that anybody with less than 5 years might not have a job when this all settled out. And I was getting married that summer, and I figured, geez, I didn't know, and we didn't know, and it was one of them. I happened to bump into a guy that worked this New York division that went over on the first set of bids, which was April 1st. And I was working a passenger job, and he just happened to be back visiting. And I walked into the crew room in Hoboken, and he was there. And I said something to somebody about D&H. I said, well, why don't you talk to so-and-so over there? His name was Billy Phillips. It said, talk to him. He went over on the D&H. So he said, oh, yeah, we got all sorts of work. So I talked to my future wife and said, well, what do you think? And she said, well, if you think that's what we should do, so I put the bid in to go to the D&H, and actually was awarded to work out of Buffalo to Hornell, New York. That was a crew change point. And to this day, I tease my wife about, boy, you must have really wanted to get out of your parents' house real bad, because when I said we had to move to Buffalo, you didn't even flinch. You just said, okay. So we wound up living the first year up in Buffalo.
From what you experienced in that month and what you heard from coworkers who stayed with Conrail longer, how was that transition for them?
Well, it was pretty good. Even the first month, I remember, they came out with some changes that we weren't used to on the EL, but it seemed to go pretty smooth. We had some new forms as working as conductors that you had to fill out and that, and it didn't seem to go too bad. The work stayed, that the fear, I think, that was there, I don't think I would have lost my job if I had stayed there. I don't think it was as bad as they were thinking, that as far as men, because you had the Jersey Central, you had the Lehigh Valley, you had the EL, so they didn't know how this was all going to play out, where different work was going to go and stuff like that. So that was the fear that some yards might close, some work might shift, and being I was on the low end, everything's seniority, you might get bumped. But it didn't happen from what I gather when I talked to people that I did know at that time by bumping into them or something, and I'd be home and talk to somebody, and it didn't actually happen. So but it seemed the transition went pretty smooth. There was probably more of a hassle with the D&H. In the D&H experience, a lot of growing pains. When I came to the D&H, they weren't used to running to Buffalo and had to deal with running over Conrail tracks, and that was a whole other thing. We were as I always kid, we were a secondhand people on Conrail. We were the D&H, and if there was a Conrail train, we were going to wait for it.
What territory did you work initially for the D&H?
From Buffalo to Hornell, New York. It was about the old Buffalo division of the Erie Lackawanna.
What state was the D&H in at that point?
Well, they ran Pennsylvania and New York, but they were a north-south route. They really didn't run west to Buffalo. It was the Erie would bring the cars in from the west and give them to them at Binghamton. And the idea of why they had to get running rights to Buffalo was to give them an access to outside Conrail, because we interchanged with Norfolk and well, at that time it was Norfolk Western at Buffalo. So theoretically, freight cars, if Conrail was basically from Chicago east, with the Norfolk Western coming in as far as Buffalo, and so same as the B&O or the B&O C&O, eventually what would become the Chessie system. But so this was the D&H could reach out and interchange with the B&O at Buffalo and then N&W at Buffalo, and also Canadian National and Canada. So they would be able to reach outside of the Conrail with their traffic. Because let's face it, if Conrail got a car to go to the D&H in Albany, they would have taken it right to Albany and handed it to them there. So the idea is that the D&H could have the car routed N&W to Buffalo, Buffalo to Binghamton, and then up the D&H.
How did working on the D&H initially compare with your time on the EL?
Well, for one, I was not used to being away at night. I might work nights, but when I worked on the EL, basically worked locals and commuter trains. So the locals were basically during the day, but there were some nights, like the Ford plant at Mahwah had 5 switch engines, and so there were 2 night jobs. And we had a Middletown turn that worked 5 o'clock at night. But basically every night I was sleeping in my own bed, or during the day if I was sleeping. When I came to the D&H, it was all over the road freight, so I went to work and then tied up in Hornell, went to the bunkhouse, and then got called to go back to Buffalo whenever. And sometimes it could be quick, and sometimes it could be long laying there. It just depended on traffic. So that was a difference, and not much local work. Not much. We were basically, I got on the train, and unless we had trouble, I was riding in the Caboose, or I was actually, my first job on the D&H was I was a qualified conductor, so I was a conductor on the road freight out of Buffalo. So I usually was riding the Caboose. Sometimes I would ride the head end and put the headman back in the Caboose with the flagman, because they were conductors too. So I'd say, well, I'm going to ride the engines today. And, but I had basically, when I came to the D&H after getting qualified, I was, on the territory, I had my own pool, what I would call pool crew. I worked with the same 2 gentlemen, so we were a crew and the same engine crew.
Did you prefer riding engines or riding in the Caboose?
I would say it's 50-50. There's part of me now that wishes I had rode the Caboose. I long for that. I did enjoy, sometimes you'd be back there and it was just, not the roar of the engine. It was just a nice ride through the country. And then there were times I wish I was on the head end because I wanted to know what the heck was going on, But I do miss the Caboose. I'm one of the, I always kid with somebody, I can tell somebody I rode a Caboose and tell my grandkids, I rode a Caboose, and they'll say, Grandpa's lying, he said he rode a Caboose, because they won't even know what a Caboose is. But yeah, I enjoy, both of them were, I would say it's 50-50. There's things I miss about, like I said, there were times they'd come out of Buffalo and you'd have the Caboose and, you'd be going and there was nothing, it was nice to be back there because you had a stove, you could cook something, but I was on a short division, so sometimes the trip was really short. We were only 89 miles, and we changed crews. So sometimes we used to get the Apollos off the N&W, which was the piggyback train, and you might be on duty at 1 in the afternoon, and by 5 o'clock you were at Hornell getting off the train because you had nobody coming against you, so it was a straight shot, and And then sometimes the train would be pulling in. This didn't always happen, but they would put you right on a westbound, and you would go back. And so we call it doubling the road in one day. They'd look and say, "Oh, you got 9 hours to work. Well, here comes this train. We're going to put you on it and get you back to Buffalo," because they were shorter crews, or they just decided to turn you because the crew that was there wasn't rested. It didn't happen that much, but it did happen.
When did you qualify as an engineer?
1984. I was selected to be a fireman because of they needed hostlers at Binghamton, because the guys that were hostling were going to be taken into engines or up to train to become engineers and get set up as engineers. So they needed hostlers. So I started there, and it was the following August that I actually was qualified as an engineer. But what happened is, probably for the first 3 or 4 months, it wasn't until the fall that we started training to be engineers. Then they took another group of guys and they filled the hostling jobs, and then we were out training to become engineers. So I got promoted in August of '85.
Were you involved with the steam excursions on the D&H where they dressed up Reading T1 number 2102 as Delaware and Hudson 302?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I was still on the Erie Lackawanna. That was a '73 for the Sesquicentennial. And I was kind of involved with the High Iron Company there because of some of the guys from the Black River went over, and we worked on when it was at Lebanon and that. But the only interaction I ever really had with it was on the deadhead move back from Albany. I got to ride from Albany back to Hoboken for the trip that they were going to run over the Erie Lackawanna that Memorial Day. I just was on the deadhead move, but I did ride the engine when it went up to this. I think we went as far as Scranton on the move out of Lebanon before it was converted. But when it ran on the north end of the railroad, no, I wasn't there on any of the fan trips. I just happened to be involved. Like I said, some of the guys went over and were helping the High Iron people, so I kind of got involved that way. And then when they made the deadhead move back, somebody said, "Hey, you want to go for a ride on the deadhead move coming back?" You could. So that's what I did. I went up and rode on the deadhead move coming back. And in fact, that was the first trip I met the road foreman, Bernie O'Brien, which some people will know his name, but I remember him from that trip. I mean, I had been on it, and it was funny because when I came to the D&H, when he came to Buffalo for, I don't know if it was his first time, but it was the first time I saw him there, he walked into the crew caller's office, and I was sitting there. I was just going on duty, and he kind of looked at me, and he knew I looked familiar, and then I looked at him, and I said, "Hi, Mr. O'Brien," and he looked at me, and he said, "Son, I think I know." I said, "Yeah." I said, "Remember the deadhead move? I rode the cab of the engine up over Arad." And, "Oh, yeah, what are you doing up here?" I said, "Work for the D&H now." And he was the one that called me and asked me if I wanted to be an engineer or you go into engine service. And, when he called, he said, "Would you like to go into engine service in 1984?
On the D&H, there was quite a mix of motive power. Some railroads tended to favor GEs, some would favor EMDs, some would favor Alcos, and the D&H seemed to have all of them. What were your preferences for operating?
Well, I always said if they could keep the Alcos, the 628s running, they'd pull the world. They'd get down to 2 miles an hour and they would just lug. But the trick was keeping them running. But they would pull. But I kind of like the EMDs. They were like like I had one machinist say, we were standing there, I was hustling, and there was a bunch of Alcos. He goes, "That's a Model T, and there's a Cadillac," and pointing to the EMD stuff. But I did like the big GEs, the 3300 U33Cs that they had, the big GEs. They were, they would pull, But the D&H, like when I came to it, that we had some 6-axle power, but basically a lot of 4-axle power. I mean, you had the 7600s were 4-axle, the 7400s, the 7300s. And it would in some of the trains, it would be you'd see 5 of those units MU'd together for the train, where if they had, say, 2 SD45s, you'd probably do the same amount of work. I mean, I got used to them on the Erie Lackawanna, like on a turn job. We'd have one of them, I'd go on the Middletown turn was one of the jobs we had, and you'd sometimes get a dual control stand, one of them, which was they had 2 control stands in them, because then you didn't have to turn the engine. The engine would just switch sides going back, but those engines would pull.
Then the first time you had a steam engine visit the D&H while you worked there was when 2317, Canadian Pacific 2317 visited, correct?
Yes, and I actually worked the first 2 years of that when they ran on the D&H up to Kingsley. I was the D&H's fireman. I was put on as the fireman for the D&H side. And then we had the Steamtown people were on there, and Bernie O'Brien was the road foreman at the time. Plus, we had an engineer. The first year was Pat Conway was the engineer, and the next year was Bill Billings. He came to the D&H via the Pennsylvania, and then the Penn Central, and then he came over just like I did on a bid. And he actually worked steam. He hired out in the 50s, in I would say the early 50s, like 52. I mean, I'm not exactly sure, but I know he worked out of Wilkes-Barre, and he worked. That was one of the last lines to convert to diesel, so he had experience working steam, because I spoke to him quite a bit about it. And even when he showed me a few tricks running the steam engine that he had learned. He was a good engineer. Pat Conway learned how to run a steam engine, but he was a Lehigh Valley employee, and he was like me. He might have hired out in '70 on the Lehigh Valley. Could even have been a couple years old, but he had never really been around any type of steam engines. Where Bill Billings had experience, early in his career, and that. But yeah, the first 2 years they ran '89 and '90. I was the D&H's fireman on the run.
What was it like firing for that engine compared to what you'd experienced on the Black River and Western with a smaller engine on a slower line?
It was completely different, because we were running it like it was meant to be run. I mean, there were times when we ran track speed with it because we didn't want to stick to freight trains. So we would run what the published speed was. So you weren't going down the railroad at a leisurely pace. Sometimes we were moving right along to get in the clear, so we weren't going to stick any freight trains. And people liked it. I mean, you got to see what the engine really could do.
The only other passenger service that the D&H had was the PA units that they would use for excursions as well as for the service up to Montreal. Were you involved with that at all?
No, but I did work with the PAs, because when they took them off passenger service, when they got the turbo, I think the turbo liners came the first round of them, they put them in freight service between Binghamton and Buffalo on the B&O train. We'd call it, going west, it would be BD1, it'd be DB1, and then going back, it would be BD2. And what it was like D&H to B&O, and then it was B&O to D&H, and they ran them for about a month that way, and they'd put one of the rebuilt RS3s that were the short nose, the 500 series that they had MK rebuilt. They would put one of them in the middle, and they would run usually those trains were limited to like a 40-car train. They just weren't big. It wasn't big trains, so they would use them there. So a couple times I happened to catch the job that had those power. But when up north, no, that would be the 3rd and 4th Division, so I wouldn't even have been up there. I didn't go north out of Binghamton until 1984 when I went fire, and that's when I went over. I became a 2nd Division fireman. So my fireman's rights were going north out of Binghamton, where my trainman's rights were to go west out of Binghamton.
When you say you were a fireman, obviously the D&H ordinarily didn't have steam engines. So what did the job entail in the diesel era?
Well, in the diesel era, is basically you're learning from the engineer. You're basically put on there, and if something goes wrong, like if an engine shuts down, you go back and you try to figure out why it shut down, so the engineer doesn't have to stop. And I mean, in the beginning, you have some books and stuff, and there's stuff that you learned as a brakeman, because sometimes you didn't have a fireman. Like when I first came over to the D&H, we had firemen that came over, but those guys eventually got promoted as engineers because, traffic picked up and now they needed more engineers, and they weren't required to have a fireman. So you learned, like, if you were on the head end and an engine shut down, you'd go back, it's rather than stop the train, you'd go back and say the engine shut down. The engineer would tell you, well, look and see if the governor button stripped. He'd tell you where it was. So I learned a lot of that stuff before I was there, but like you'd get an engine coming up the hill and it might trip the low water button, and you'd go back and start it. But a lot of the jobs, you didn't have the firemen. They were there. You were learning to become an engineer. I mean, I didn't spend a lot of time as a fireman. I spent most of my time once I got, other than when traffic would drop off due to winter or something, you might get set back in what they call fireman's position, and you'd be able to work as a fireman, rather than being furloughed. But that was, more than likely it wound up on a hostling job, because those were, the shop you had to have somebody move the engines around in the shop. So that, like I said, that's one of the reasons I was taken, because those guys were going to go out and train to be engineers. So they said, well, we need new guys. So they, I got trained as a hostler.
Speaking of the railroad's eclectic roster, one of the other items they had, known by rail fans, were the shark noses. Now, those left in the late 70s, but did you have any exposure or run-ins with those units?
They were at Binghamton, but they ran north. They used them on the pushers, and then they were up around Whitehall, basically. No, I never even saw them in Binghamton. They didn't come out on our, like the PAs ventured out on the East-West Division, and they didn't. We didn't see them. I mean, I knew that they were in Binghamton because some of the guys would tell me that. Oh yeah, the Sharks, and they used to use them on the Sayre job, because the D&H had, prior to the Conrail, the D&H would run a job out of Binghamton to Sayre to Owego, and then they'd get on the Lehigh Valley at Owego and go down to Sayre that way. And that was one of their connections that basically went away once they started running to Buffalo. There was no reason to go that way. And besides, actually north of, I'm trying to think, up to where the line went off to Ithaca, I guess stayed open. But after that, that was closed. West of that on the Lehigh Valley, they shut that down because they could run the traffic right up the old Erie Lackawanna instead of running it up over the Lehigh Valley.
Things keep going on the D&H until 1991, at which point it becomes a subsidiary of Canadian Pacific. Did that change anything as far as your day-to-day operations or how the railroad viewed itself?
Well, yeah, we saw a big increase in some traffic. CP came in, and it was changed from the Guilford era. I mean, that's an era that a lot of people on the D&H would like to forget. But they saw some increase in traffic and expansion of business. I mean, we did go through in the 89 and 90, we were under, NYS&W ran us. So the operations, we didn't go to Harrisburg anymore. Then once the CP came in, they opened up the line and started going back to Harrisburg. More trains, traffic picked up. So it was a little different. It was, the one thing, the freight railroads, you don't have a schedule. At least with D&H, we had, there were pool crews, and your marking times, you had a rough idea when trains would go, but the times could vary. And some days they would cancel jobs, okay, we're not going to run this train today, but it seemed when the CP came in, the business really picked up, and, we had more of a regular schedule.
What made the Guilford era so difficult?
Well, I think it was, he got the railroad, and for whatever reason wanted to pick a fight with labor, and, it depends on who you think is right and who you think is wrong. I would love to ask, we gave them, we were down to actually, crew sizes were getting smaller, through attrition and stuff like that, but, it just seemed, I don't know, maybe he didn't want the railroad, or he wanted to strip it of its assets. That's going to be left for the historians, but all I know is that it just seemed that, whatever, at the beginning, the labor gave whatever they asked for, and then it just turned into a big battle. And then he bankrupted the company, put us into bankruptcy, and he put the D&H into bankruptcy, and NYSW got appointed directed service. So they ran us until the trustee could find somebody to buy us, which was the CP.
So that must have been a welcome change by that point.
Well, yeah, it was. I laugh because now Norfolk Southern owns half of the D&H, but if you go back to prior to Conrail, the Norfolk Western owned the D&H under Derrico. They owned the Erie Lackawanna and the D&H under Derrico, and it's like, you guys should have just kept this. You would have had it all. But, that's business. It was, When Guilford came in, people thought it was going to be great things, and so all the workers did, and because we had gone through some hard times. The D&H was always struggling. I mean, when you really look at when they created Conrail, and then they kept the D&H separate because it was solvent, but they basically surrounded the D&H with a railroad, and they had to compete against Conrail, and they did Bruce Sturging and that did a marvelous job trying to compete, but they were fighting an uphill battle. And, I remember one old Conrail employee, I was down in Allentown, and we got talking, and he said, you always go bigger, you don't go smaller, because he was talking about me going over to the D&H. Of course, I made a decision at 21, to go to the D&H, and I mean, you're young, and, just think, well, I'm being told I might not have a job, so I want to have a job, and it just, for the first couple of years, it was a nice place to work. It was a nice company to work for. I mean, they always family-oriented. There was a smaller operation in the Erie Lackawanna, so you felt more part of the team and stuff like that. And then eventually things just deteriorated. Not so much, I mean, there's a lot to be said for the D&H people. If it wasn't for them, the D&H might not have made it to. I even had an official tell me that, even under the bankruptcy. If it wasn't for the D&H employees, the D&H might not have made it to CP, because we basically did pull together. We might be arguing, but we're pulling together. We had to fight Conrail, for everything, and government created, and not saying that was right or wrong. But the D&H was left out in the cold. It was, it wasn't brought in. The thing that gets me about Guilford is, if you fast forwarded to now, if Guilford had, at one point, Guilford was supposed to, when they wanted to sell Conrail to Norfolk Western back in the 80s, Guilford was going to get Buffalo to Chicago and Buffalo to St. Louis. They were going to get, more expanded. Well, you fast forward now, that railroad would be huge. But, that's for the historians to sort out what's right, what's wrong.
It's funny how that would have all changed the landscape dramatically.
Oh, yeah. I look at it, and it's like, you realize you'll be able to say to BNSF or UPSB, well, you want to buy it, we can put you in downtown New York or in Boston. I mean, we had trackage rights. I mean, when the D&H grew overnight on April 1st from a 400-mile long railroad to 1,700 miles. I mean, when you look at it, they gained, as of the Conrail creation, they got trackage rights from DuPont all the way to Oak Island on the Lehigh Valley. And they purchased the Sunbury line from Wilkes-Barre to Sunbury, and then they got trackage rights to Harrisburg with haulage rights from Harrisburg to Potomac Yard, and then those haulage rights in, I think it was 1980, turns into trackage rights. So the D&H was running all the way to Potomac Yard. And then they had the rights on April 1st all the way to Buffalo. And I had included the Greggsville branch to go to the salt mine. And, so they grew substantially. There was actually more trackage rights territory than the D&H itself. And then, like I said, it was by the D&H itself. They put out a valid effort, the management, the expansion, and all of that. And then, lo and behold, the 82 came along, and you had the crisis, and things started falling apart, and then the D&H got sold to Guilford, or Guilford bought the D&H, and that lasted, then in I think it was 86, we had a strike that was all over a few people up in Maine, and it just put a bad taste, and it turned out that eventually he bankrupted the D&H. Guilford kept the B&M and the Maine Central, but they bankrupted us, and that's how we wound up with CP.
So you end up working with CP, works out a lot better. Then the next time you get to play with steam locomotives as part of your job is when Milwaukee Road number 261 came east for the Steamtown opening.
Yes. Yeah, and whenever it moved on to D&H, I was on it. The road foreman, Bernie O'Brien, wanted me on there. And they looked for a crew to work with the train whenever it worked. They wanted the same crew. And, being I had steam experience, he wanted to, so that was put out, that whenever it moved, they would like me to be part of it. Their guys did most of the running. I did get a chance to run the engine, but we were basically there as pilots. Norm Barrett was another guy that was on the engine crew. He was on, and we had so I had the experience of it. I mean, I talked till I was blue in the face to try to get them to run the trip up to D&H to Schenectady to where the engine was built. It fell on deaf ears. I mean, I even pitched it to at that time was Paul Gilmore was the president of the D&H, or he was whether you'd call him the president, but he was appointed by CP to run the D&H. And we at that time had a safety committee. I said, you could make lots of money for the safety committee. I mean, you could run this, if you ran this trip every weekend in the summer, you would sell the train out, because the fact was that the Northeast had been dry for mainline excursions at that time. And I said, the only thing that ran, and I don't know, this would have been 96, so I think the last mainline excursions would have been early 90s, maybe 89, 9, when the 614 ran to Port Jervis. So people in the Northeast would have come from all over to ride a mainline trip. But it fell on deaf ears. They just didn't want to, they didn't want. I don't think they wanted to interfere with their freight stuff. But I pitched it. You sell 1,000 tickets and you're going to make a lot of money. But they didn't. Because at the time the engine was stuck. It was at Steamtop for a whole year, so it would have been a good time to run it. But yeah, when we brought it in from Buffalo. I was the engineer, brought it in because I was qualified on the Southern Tier. So, we brought it in, and that was an all-night adventure. We didn't go to work until like 6 o'clock at night at Buffalo. There were some issues, and to get us routed over the Conrail to come to Binghamton and then on to Scranton. So, and then we had rainstorm, signals were down. It turned into, I went by my house at 4 a.m. And when I blew the whistle, my road forester said, "What are you blowing a whistle?" I said, "Well, I live up on the hill there." I said, "Wonder if my wife's going to hear me." And when I got home, I said, "Hey, did you hear us go through it?" She said, "Oh, yeah." She says, "I thought the engine was coming into the bedroom because it had a very loud whistle on it." And the tracks are about a half a mile from my house. So, But yeah, that was a nice engine to work with. That was Steve Sandberg and that group, a very professional group. They run a very professional engines in good shape and stuff. So I was fortunate. I bummed a ride going back to Minneapolis with it the following year. When Steve and Sandberg invited me and said, "Well, if you want to go back, ride back with us, you're more than welcome." And so me and another guy, Kurt Zell, who was a conductor from the Erie Lackawanna that came over to the D&H. We were only going to go to Chicago, and then when we got to Chicago, it turned into, you're never going to get to do this again. Let's go all the way to Minneapolis. So we did.
That would be a really cool experience.
Oh, it was, yeah. It was. I remember calling the head of the calling bureau because we had taken vacation for a week, and called the head of the calling bureau. He said to me, he goes, "Well, what if I tell you got to come back?" I said, "Well, my cell phone's dying." So what'd you say? What'd you say? And he laughed. He said, "All right, I'll change your vacation," because we had basically worked with that engine the whole time. And he said, change the vacation. And then it was funny. There's a little funny story about my wife thought I was coming home, and what happened is we were supposed to, when the engine got into Chicago, we were going to get off and get on the eastbound, whatever they call it, the passenger train that goes through Buffalo. And then, so when we got there late, and we missed that train. So we rode out to Aurora because that's where they were going to park it. We figured, well, the next day we'll take the commuter train in. And we got talking to the guys there. They said, "Well, we're going to go up to Union, Illinois, to the museum. You guys, the train doesn't go till 8 o'clock at night or whatever it was. I think it was 8." So I said, "Yeah, we'll go up with you." And then we get up there, and I said to Kurt, we got talking. I said, "Kurt, we're never going to get this opportunity to do this again. I mean, really, it's not going to happen." And he goes, well, I'll go if you go. So I said, okay. So I went over, there's a pay phone, and my cell phone had died prior to it. And so I called on the payphone and talked to and my wife wasn't home. So I come back and I said to Kurt, I said, well, I took the chicken way out. And she said, what's that? I said, I just left her a message and told her I was going to Minneapolis. I figure she can't get a hold of me. My phone's dead. But I did call her later that day and told her, and I said, she goes, she understood, and she says, oh, but you're going to owe me big time. I said, yeah. So we were gone for almost 2 weeks. But it was a fun time. I really, probably stands as one of the highlights of my career, taking that back. I mean, it was 1,600 some miles behind a steam engine. You're not going to really get to do that too often.
No, that is very unique to get that opportunity and to work with people like that.
Yeah, no, it was a very good group. Met some real nice people. I can't say enough about it. Like I said, and in fact, I even on the trip back, Bill Withune was involved with that group, and he gave me a copy of one of the books he had made, a new book that had come out, and signed it. And in it, he makes a reference that who would have ever thought that we would be together, on this. And he rode he got on, I think, when it left Scranton, he was on it, and he stayed till Fort Wayne, and then he got off, and we were going, that's where he got off. But yeah, it was a nice trip, and I've always thought about, boy, if I lived a little closer to Minneapolis, I'd be involved with that group, but I'm here in the East, so.
Since you mentioned that you were familiar with the D&H leadership, I'm wondering if you had any interactions with Carl Belke.
Yeah, I knew Carl Belke. Yeah, I got to know him. Actually, he was appointed president when we went bankrupt. But yeah, I knew Carl. He had come out, and even when we were at the steam train, he had come down and rode the steam train in '89 and '90 because he knew Bernie O'Brien. But yeah, I knew him. Even though he was there, he left the D&H, went to the Rock Island, I guess, and then came back under Guilford, and then was there until CP came in.
So you worked with CP, D&H, until 2015, and it was toward the end of your career that there were rumors and murmurings that Norfolk Southern was going to try to move in and work out a deal with CP. What were you hearing at the time?
I was hearing that. We heard it was actually. There was a period, too, at one point where prior to that they were talking to selling the D&H, but that fell. They gave up the trackage rights to Buffalo. I shouldn't say they gave them up. They stopped using the trackage rights to Buffalo, and they allowed NS to run the trains, and that's when they got the rights to run to Elkhart from, through Elkhart on to Chicago out of Windsor, Canada, Detroit, came that way. So that. Then the rumor of the sale died out, and then years later, all of a sudden it came back. I think that was around 2005 or 2006 that they did that, and then, like I said, it kind of died out. Everything seemed to be all right, and then in, I would say, mid 2014, the rumors were, what's going to happen. We hear the NS, rumors on the road. You really don't want to pay attention to them because you'd go crazy. And, I was coming up, I was going to turn 60 on January. My birthday's January 1st. So I was going to turn 60. So I knew I was going to probably retire then. And some guys say, oh, you should have stayed. They didn't take over didn't buy the part of the D&H until November. I think it's November someplace or October. So I wasn't going to stay that much longer. My wife, even if I'd stayed to my wife's birthday, which would have been August of that year, I would have made it on the D&H. But I just decided it was time. Just the way things were going, and it was just time. And one of the bosses that I worked under, Bill Farley, he said to me once, we got talking about retirement, and he goes, Steve, one day beyond the day you can retire, you're never getting that day back. And that's what I looked at, and I retired January 1st, 2015. I was actually, my last run was on the 23rd of December because I went on vacation. But then the railroad, in its infinite wisdom, made me mark back up after vacation, and I knew I wasn't going to work, but because Christmas and that fell in my vacation, to get paid the holidays, the agreement is I have to be available the day after my vacation. So I knew my crew wouldn't go to work, and I did what I could. I tried to talk to labor relations and said to the guy, you really don't, I mean, you don't want me to mark up. I'm going to bump an engineer off a job. And it's not, well, so we went back and forth, and they said, no, you got to mark up. Okay, fine, I'll mark up. And I marked up Sunday night at 9 o'clock for midnight. And then, because we used to get a 3-hour call. And then the next night I called at midnight and marked off. And so they couldn't say, well, you marked off before. And when I talked to the crew dispatcher, the girl said, because they'd always ask you how you wanted to book off. And I told this girl, and she said, well, Mr. Vaughan, how would you like to book off? And I said, well, I've waited 41 and a half years to tell you this, forever. And she goes, I can't put that down. I said, yeah, you can. I said, I'm retiring tomorrow. And I said, it's forever. She goes, you've been on the railroad 41 and a half years? I said, yeah. She goes, that's longer than I've been alive. I said, well, what can I say? But yeah, and there's a lot that I learned. It's like I told somebody, I never realized till after I retired the things the railroad did take from me. There was times, I'm not saying it in a bad way, but there's a lot of things you don't, when you just start, like I did with the job, it just was natural. But then after I retired, I realized all the things, and my wife even said, once you're trying to do all the things you missed out on. I said, well, yeah. Train shows and stuff like that, or every time I did try, in my family, I was one of the first ones to have a cell phone, and my brothers really needed it more than I did, but I got it because I had come in from Allentown, and I was going to get a pager, and because things were really getting hectic, both my boys played base little league, and so going to work, I'd have to go to the payphone, and I'd have to call and tell a caller, okay, I'll call you back in 30 minutes if you're looking, because I was on the extra list, and I just happened to work with a guy who had what they called the brick, and him and his brother had a side business of sheetrock, and his brother basically, so when he wasn't working on the railroad, he would work with, so he had this cell phone. And, these are in the infant days of cell phones. And I showed it to me, and I said, gee, that's pretty neat. And he said, yeah. He says, I go out of my house, like the railroad can call. So on the way home from work, I hear whatever the predecessor of Verizon was advertising this phone for $99, and you contract, and it's 15 cents a minute, and it's $15 a month for the contract, and 15 cents a minute for the call. And I took a shower, and me and my wife went over to the office, and I wound up buying this phone and, getting the phone. And it was 1992, I think. And, it just allowed me to be at a Little League game with my kids. And if the phone rang, I could take the call for work. So it was like, you didn't leave your house. And when I first started on the railroad, you didn't leave. If you left your house, you might miss a call, and it wasn't so much you'd get in trouble. I mean, they didn't like you missing calls, but the punishment was you also lost your wages and you went last out on the extra list. So, so that was one of the things that, I realized now I don't have to listen to the phone. I tell some of the younger guys that remember one of the last things you would do if you were going to bed at night, you'd pick the phone up, make sure there's a dial tone there. So especially if you thought you were getting called.
So what have you been enjoying in your retirement?
Well, modeling, like I said, doing some stuff. Also doing, like at the EBT thing, I get to go down there. Had some family function things interfere with that. I didn't make the last two. The 1 year was my granddaughter's christening was that year, and and then last year it was there was something else that came up that we didn't go down as a group. The group went down the year before, but I didn't go with them. So yeah, I get to do that stuff, stuff like that. And of course, my wife's happy because she gets some of the things that I couldn't do. I had a friend of mine one time kidding me about the train layout, and he goes, he said, geez, you haven't built the layout. I said, no. He goes, so I kidded with him about time, and I said, how much time are you away from your house with your job? And he said, I don't get what you mean. I said, well, okay, you work in the city of Binghamton, so you work 40 hours, half an hour commute each way. I said, it's, you're 45 hours. You're not at your house during the week, right? He goes, well, yeah. I said, I do that in one trip sometimes. and I'm gone. And then I get home and I'm going to go to work. Like when I was working in Harrisburg, we would get home at, say, midnight last night, and we'd be off all day today. But then at 3 a.m. tomorrow, I was going back to Harrisburg. So you'd have everything that you couldn't, you would have to do it in that one day. If you might want to mow the lawn today because guess what? You're gonna be gone, and then the next time it might be raining when you get home or whatever. I'm not complaining about it. It's just a different way of living. As a friend of mine, Joe Patch, used to say, railroad is all you are is a bum with a gold watch. And because you live out of a bag, you got your road bag and it's always ready to go.
Last question I've got for you, Steve, is when you look back at your career and the choices you made to work with the railroad, what are you most grateful for about that time?
I'm grateful for the people I met that I worked with, and also I'm grateful the railroad did provide me with somebody with a high school education. I mean, was able to provide for my family. There's good and bad. I mean, it's different when you're a trade. It's not all fun. I kid when I hear some of these guys talk about operations of the model trains. It's not a bad thing, but I remember being out freezing in the middle of the night, switching cripples out of a train, saying, "Boy, I wish I was home in bed." But I enjoyed it. It was, it gave me a good livelihood and a good retirement. As I told one of the new employees we hired after CP, he kidded when he heard that I had almost 30 years at that point. Man, you worked one place for 30 years? I go, well, yeah, I didn't take this job. I said, I took this job to take me from high school to the cemetery plot. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, my grandfather and my uncle both worked for the railroad, and I know they got decent pensions. And I said, that's part of it. So I'll put up with the nonsense of getting called or, like I said, everybody's that worked on the railroads it's like their house is bugged. I go back to a story. My wife and I, the kids, both our sons were off to not at home anymore. And it was an Easter. We were going to go to church and had everything planned. I knew I'd be going to work at about 1 or 2 in the afternoon. Said, we'll go to church. We'll go for early, brunch. And the phone rang at 4 a.m. for 7. And when a girl said to me, she gave me the train symbol, she goes, 557-0700, Steve. I said, nah, you want the crew out of Harrisburg, because the train came up out of Philadelphia to Harrisburg and then on to Binghamton. And I had been on this job for probably almost a year. And every trip when that train would come would be 1 or 2 in the afternoon. So I said to her, no, you want the crew out of Harrisburg. Nope, you're marked. Okay. So I kidded with my wife. I hung up the phone up. I said, well, I'm going to get there, and I'll bet you they made the mistake. They called the wrong crew. But I got there, and there was a train. My wife said when she said, they got the house bugged that they knew we were going to. I said, I don't know. It's just they just seem that's the way things work with the railroad.
What an adventure.
Oh, yeah, no, it was. I mean, it was. As Davey Short, a friend of mine I worked with on the railroad, said, it's been an interesting ride.
It absolutely sounds like it. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Steve, and sharing with us your experience. Good luck with your future modeling endeavors, and enjoy the rest of your retirement.
I will, hopefully, down at the East Broad Top.
Excellent choice of location.
Oh, yeah. It's quite exciting what's happening there. And by the way, congratulations on your marriage. I saw the pictures in the timber transfer. I meant to tell you that earlier.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Speaking of having very understanding wives, whether it be of work or hobby, mine definitely falls in that category.
Oh, yeah, my wife is the same. I had a friend of Norm Cole I told you about. He kidded with me when he met my future wife. At that time, she was my girlfriend. He says, she'll make a good railroad wife. And she has. She's put up with me not being here when things happen, and, she's got to deal with it. And that's a whole other story. It does take a special wife to be involved with that, I think she was a little surprised when I told her, about my train collection when we first started dating, and then I think she thought I had like 1 or 2 trains, and when she started seeing it, it's like, oh, I guess you do collect them.
And now, the question of the day.
Speaking of the East Broad Top, last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking with Brad Esposito, the general manager for the East Broad Top Foundation, about the exciting news that this narrow gauge line in Pennsylvania is coming back to life. And that raised the question, what excites you about this being restored to operation? Loads of responses. So here's ones that I selected from you guys. First from Facebook, Ed Lacayer responds, the opportunity to present interactive preservation of railroad and industrial heritage in full context, including location, purpose, tools, and machinery, and transportation. Mike Hune writes, the volunteer opportunities to come. Good point, Mike, and febt.org/volunteer if you want to see what opportunities exist for volunteering with the railroad and helping to restore it. That's the place to go. Daryl Rule writes, getting to take my family there like my parents did with me. Gotta love the multi-generation aspect of it. From Twitter, Prof HBTM writes, everything. My mom grew up over in Saxton on the Huntington and Broad Top Mountain Railroad. Knew about you guys in 1948. Welcome back. From YouTube, A. Stevens Krug writes, first, to preserving and operating the East Broad Top as a steam railroad. Second, to educating visitors about the role of railroads in local and national history. And third, to promoting local and regional tourism and economic growth. From theroundhousepodcast.com, Dave C. writes, the future looks bright for the EBT. Thanks in part to Joe Kowalczyk, his father Nick, and their family for keeping this unique short line virtually intact since 1956. There will be a lot of work to do. Get involved. Dan Thomas writes, engine shop, multiple steam engines, nice train station, scenic railway system with a decent ride time, family venue atmosphere with the picnic stop and ice cream shop at the train station, various theme events throughout the year, photo shoot excursions, a trolley museum nearby, and last but not least, its huge fan base. And last comment, Dave Collier writes, the most exciting thing for me is that I get to share my family's history involving the railroad. My great-grandfather, Drew, was a long-time engineer and the engineer on the last revenue run. My grandfather, Frel, worked the lathe in the machine shop until operations ceased. That's a very good point to make. There's so much family history surrounding the East Broad Top, both in its common carrier era pre-1956 and the first tourism era. Now we all get to look forward to the second era of tourism. Your question of the day for this episode is, if you were alive in the 1980s, what was your favorite railroad to railfan? And if you weren't, which one do you wish you could have experienced? Let me know on theroundhousepodcast.com. You can comment there. We have links to social media, Facebook and Twitter. Appreciate you guys joining us for our explorations into the industry and the hobby. And we are coming up on 100 episodes. So as always, if you have ideas for people we should talk to or topics we should cover, just shoot me an email and let me know. Thanks for tuning in. And remember, as always, that the Roundhouse is our house.